This is Kathy from Gadgets Top 321, and in today's video I'll be taking a look at Robert Oster Australian Opal Blue. I'll test it in a variety of pins and nib sizes ranging from a Pilot Extra Fine to a 1.5 stub. And I'm going to begin with the Pilot Extra Fine. This is a Pilot 78G Plus with a steel extra fine nib. And I can tell this is unpleasant. Yes, it's scratchy. And this is a very unsaturated ink. You can see right here the little X where I smeared the ink. It's got some wetness, but the X almost wiped away, so I'm going to make a note. This is scratchy. Next, I've got a Pilot Pereira with a steel fine nib. A little bit better. And it looks a little better. It's putting down a wider line. It's a little more legible. And it's decently wet, but it feels dry. There's ink being put down on the paper, but it just feels dry. So still not pleasant. Next, I've got a Pilot Custom 74 with a 14 karat fine nib. This is much better. Now, it's not as smooth as most inks tend to feel in this Custom 74. There's definitely feedback, quite a bit wetter, but I would classify this as nice. This is a nice writing experience. I don't mind a little feedback, and the legibility of that, it looks good, it puts down a good amount of ink. It's not unpleasant feeling, so that was all right. All right, next is the Kaweco Perkeo with a medium nib. I have high hopes for this combination. This is a pen that shows off nice shading characteristics of an ink. And this feels a little dry, but this medium nib, the wideness of it makes it not unpleasant, a not unpleasant amount of feedback. So I'm going to classify this one as nice also. It put out a decent amount of ink, and I'm curious to see when we look at that up close what kind of shading we're getting. First impressions are good of that combination. Next, I've got a Pilot Metropolitan with a cursive medium nib. Now, this ink has felt dry in the previous nibs, and it feels dry in this one. And with this being a stub nib, I'm not going to classify this as feeling nice. It's usable, but it felt dry, and just that made it feel a little unpleasant. Next, I've got a Nemesign Singularity with a 0.6 stub nib. Make sure I'm in focus. As usual, with this nib, putting down a nice amount of ink. And this stub was much nicer than the Metropolitan stub. It's a more rounded nib, so it's more forgiving. Let me see if I can. Instead of being squared off like the Metropolitan nib is, it's rounded, so it's more forgiving with these drier inks. And finally, I've got a Jinhao X750 with a 1.5 stub nib. It was a little bit dry there on the startup. Had a little bit of trouble grabbing onto the paper, but putting down a nice amount of ink. So we'll give that a second to dry while we look at a few other paper samples, writing samples. I've got my little ARC notebook that has somewhat absorbent paper, but you see it, the finer nibs were actually, the extra fine nib was scratchy, but the Pereira was the nicest out of all of these. The wetter nibs, with this being an absorbent paper, just didn't feel that great to write on. The Metropolitan, again, felt dry, but even the wetter nibs, they just felt okay. And you can kind of see here the issue with the ink spread. It just wasn't a pleasant writing experience. You can see a little bit of shading with that really wide stub nib. The Kaweco, didn't see a lot of shading. It just felt like writing with a magic marker. And if we look at some bleed through, but with this being a lighter colored ink, it's not as noticeable except on the 1.5 stub nib. My first impressions are this ink is not a pleasant ink to write with on poor quality paper, but if you do, just a nice fine nib. That's a good balance between how much ink it's putting down on the paper and the size of the nib. On my Rhodia paper, now this is a better quality paper. The fine nibs felt a little dry. The wetter Custom 74 was the nicest writing experience. And the Nemesign, I made a note, it felt kind of sticky on the page. It wasn't scratchy, but I guess just the dryness of the page, it didn't want to glide across the page. And that's unusual for this Nemesign. The Nemesign is usually very forgiving, but the Custom 74, since it tends to write pretty wet for a fine nib, was the best. And then we go back to poor quality paper, our 20-pound copy paper, and again we're back to the Pereira. So the fine nibbed Pereira offered the best writing experience for poor quality paper, and the wetter writing Custom 74 fine nib gave me the best writing experience for good quality paper. And you notice how quickly on this copy paper, it just soaked up the ink immediately. In my Leuchtturm, let's see what we saw here. There's no sheen. I'm not seeing any sheen, but I'm seeing just a little bit of shading, and in this color blue, that's just very pleasant. That turned out really nicely. And let's see, on the Tomoe River paper, no sheen, but with the stub nib again, a nice little bit of shading. Let's see, when I wrote up here with the stub nib, we got some nice shading. And let's see, on Tomoe River, like your top-notch fountain pen friendly paper, the wetter nibs were the best. This is one of those inks. It's not very saturated. It's watery. It didn't stick to the nib on any of my dip tests, and it just felt dry in finer nibs. Alright, if you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.